Cold steel pressed hard against his throat. Sheriff Arthur Brody felt the sharp edge, bite just enough to draw a bead of sweat. Or was it blood? He couldn't tell. All he knew was the raw, paralyzing terror clawing its way up from his gut. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, loud in the suffocating stillness of his own office. This was his domain, yet the eye staring back at him, burning with a white-hot hatred from beneath a grime-streaked brow, held all the power. They belonged to Martha Hayes, the quiet widow, the woman he dismissed, wronged, and tried to erase. He, the untouchable lawman of Redemption Gulch, the man who commanded fear with a glance, was pinned, helpless, a pathetic tremor running through his body. The crookedly pinned badge on his vest felt like a brand, searing his failure into his very soul. How had the mouse cornered the hawk? The answer was a story etched in dust, deceit, and the unbending will of a woman finally claiming her due, a final, brutal reckoning years in the making. Redemption Gulch. The name was a prayer whispered against the harsh reality of the landscape. A clutch of weathered buildings huddled beside a sluggish creek, shimmering under a sky bleached white by the relentless sun. Dust was the fifth element here, coating everything, tasting of grit and broken dreams. Life was hardscrabble, scraped from unforgiving soil, and overseen by Sheriff Arthur Brody. He wasn't the biggest man to wear a star, but his presence filled every room he entered. His vest remained impeccably buttoned, his silver badge a mirror catching the fear in lesser men's eyes. He'd ridden into town years ago, a man seemingly without a past, and quickly imposed his own brand of order, an order built on whispered threats, leveraged favors, and the heavy silence that fell whenever he paused mid-sentence, letting the unspoken consequences hang in the air. He silenced the rowdiest saloon crowds with a single, cold glance, his authority needing no shouted commands. Folks whispered their speculations about where he came from, what shadows clung to his coattails, but only ever behind closed doors. Brody liked it that way. Fear kept things tidy. Living on the frayed edge of this uneasy peace was Martha Hayes, a woman defined by absences, the absence of her husband, Frank, the absence of their former prosperity, the absence of noise around her small, isolated cabin. Her face was a canvas of quiet sorrow, lines etched by sun and grief around eyes that held the wisdom of loss. She worked a small, stubborn plot of land just outside the town proper, a place most folks considered barely worth the claim stakes. Her cabin, though small, was meticulously kept, a stark contrast to the wildness surrounding it. She traded fresh eggs and mended torn shirts for flour and salt, her interactions in town brief, almost fleeting. She was the widow Hayes, a figure of quiet endurance. Frank, her husband, had been gone 2 years now. A good man, folks recalled dimly, hard-working, maybe a bit naive, taken by a sudden fever out on their old claim up the valley, a much richer piece of land than the one Martha now clung to. Sheriff Brody himself had handled the estate matters efficiently, clinically, ensuring Martha was settled into poverty and isolation. Most saw her quietness as resignation, a spirit broken by the harshness of the frontier. They didn't see the flicker of watchful intelligence deep within her gaze, the way her hands, though calloused from work, remained steady. They didn't feel the cold knot that tightened in her stomach every time Brody's shadow fell across the dusty street, a knot woven from grief, suspicion, and memories she guarded like embers. Her life wasn't peaceful. It was dormant, a powder keg of injustice waiting for a single spark. That spark came disguised as civic duty. Sheriff Brody began taking an uncommon interest in Martha's dusty acre. It started subtly. He'd rein his horse in near her fence line, not looking at her, but at the thin ribbon of water cutting through the corner of her property, the only reliable stream for miles, save the town well itself. He'd comment, his voice smooth as worn leather, about the dry spell gripping the territory. Mighty dry season, Martha, he'd drawl, tapping his riding crop against his polished boot. Water's becoming more precious than gold. His eyes would flick from the stream to her small cabin, a predatory gleam betraying the casual tone. Martha would stand on her porch, feeling his gaze like a physical weight. "It always provides, Sheriff," she'd reply, her voice soft but firm. "Frank, Frank knew this spot was blessed. Saying her dead husband's name aloud felt like unsheathing a knife, just a fraction. Brody's smile was thin, reptilian. Frank, right. Terrible shame, what happened? Still, lines get messy out here. Deeds get misplaced. He wouldn't explain further, just wheel his horse around, leaving the unspoken threat to fester in the heat. Then came the deputies. Young Caleb, Brody's eager acolyte, arrived bearing official paper. A fine. Improper fencing maintenance. Payable now. The fence was old but sound, unchanged since Frank built it. Martha watched Caleb's eyes, saw the borrowed arrogance, the pleasure he took in delivering this petty blow. She paid from her dwindling cache of coins saved from selling eggs, her face impassive. But as Caleb rode off, whistling, she noted the precise angle of his horse's stride, the way he avoided looking her directly in the eye. Small details. Brody wasn't just flexing his power. He was testing her. He saw her solitude, her lack of powerful friends, and smelled weakness. He needed her land, perhaps for the water, perhaps as a final piece in a puzzle only he understood, a puzzle connected to Frank and their lost prosperity. He assumed she'd crumble or flee. He gravely miscalculated the tensile strength, forged in grief, the sharp mind hidden behind quiet eyes. The coldness in her gut wasn't fear anymore. It was purpose beginning to crystallize. The sheriff thought he was prodding a rabbit. He had no inkling he was stirring something far more patient and far more dangerous. The confrontation wasn't a matter of if, but when. And Martha began, quietly, to prepare for that when. The sheriff's campaign became a slow, grinding siege, not with bullets, but with bureaucratic thorns and deliberate aggravations designed to wear her down. One sweltering afternoon, Martha found her small water barrel overturned, the precious contents soaked into the thirsty dust. No footprints nearby this time, just the lingering scent of Brody's cheap cigar, smoke clinging to the air. Coincidence, he would have said if asked. Another day. The harness for her mule was expertly sliced in a way that looked like wear and tear, but rendered it useless until repaired, costing her a vital trip to town for supplies. Small cuts, designed to bleed her resources and her spirit dry. Deputy Caleb became a frequent, unwelcome visitor, riding out on flimsy pretexts, checking brands that hadn't changed in years, asking questions about non-existent stray cattle. His presence a constant, low-level intimidation. Brody watched these developments from afar, often observing Martha's property from a ridge overlooking the valley, a hawk surveying its territory, confident in its dominance. He saw her toil, her quiet perseverance, and mistook it for defeat taking root. But Martha was not wilting. She was watching. Her quietness wasn't passivity. It was a cloak of invisibility. She learned Brody's routines with the precision of a hunter studying its prey. The late hours he kept, alone in his office after dismissing Caleb, the clink of the whiskey bottle against glass, the specific creak of the floorboard outside his window. She noted the way he always sat with his back to that window, overconfident in his security. She walked the perimeter of the town at dusk, mapping the alleys, the deepest pools of shadow, the quickest routes from her cabin to the heart of Brody's power. Inside her cabin, late at night, the transformation continued. The grief for Frank remained a deep ache, but it was now overlaid with something harder, colder. Resolve. She took out Frank's old hunting knife, not just honing the edge, but feeling its balance, its grim potential. It felt like an extension of Frank's stolen life, a tool not just for survival, but for justice. She practiced tying knots with the sturdy rope she'd ostensibly bought for fence repairs, her fingers moving with quiet dexterity in the lamplight. When she did venture into Redemption Gulch, she listened more intently than ever. She heard the grumbling about Brody's heavy-handed fines, the fear that kept decent folks silent, the simmering resentment hidden beneath nervous pleasantries. She saw the cracks in his authority, hairline fractures of distrust, even if no one dared challenge him openly. Brody had built his castle on fear, but fear, she knew, could curdle into hate. And hate was patient. She was patient. She gathered her strength, husbanded her resources, and observed every detail, waiting for the inevitable mistake, the moment when the sheriff, blinded by his own arrogance, would push her one step too far. The final shove came under the cover of smoke and chaos. As twilight bled across the sky, casting long shadows, a cry went up. Fire! Flames licked greedily at the dry pasture belonging to the Miller family, Martha's closest neighbors, though still a good mile distant. Panic erupted. Men grabbed buckets, forming a frantic line from the creek, their shouts swallowed by the crackling roar. Before the last embers were even stamped out, Sheriff Brody appeared at Martha's cabin, astride his horse like a dark omen against the smoke-stained sky. Deputy Caleb hovered behind him, looking pale and uncertain. Brody didn't waste time on pretense. He swung down, his boots hitting the packed earth with solid thuds of authority. His face was a mask of righteous accusation. "Martha Hayes," he declared, his voice sharp enough to cut through the evening air. "We got folks saw someone hightailing it from the Miller place just before she went up. Said they looked a lot like you. Heading this way." Martha stood in her doorway, bathed in the flickering orange glow from the distant fire. She didn't flinch. "That's a lie, Sheriff. I've been right here." Brody's lip curled into a sneer. "That's convenient. Reckon you'll have to come along. Arson's a hanging offense out here, widow." He started towards her, hand outstretched, ready to clamp onto her arm and drag her away. This was it. The precipice. Weeks of pressure, years of buried grief and suspicion, culminated in this moment. Arrest, false charges, the loss of her home, her freedom, the final erasure of her existence. Something didn't just snap inside Martha. It forged itself into cold, hard steel. The time for endurance was over. The time for reckoning had arrived. She offered no resistance, no further argument. Her gaze flickered past Brody for just a second, towards the dark shape of the hills where Frank lay buried. Then she gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "All right, Sheriff. Just let me get a shawl." Brody, confident he'd finally broken her, smirked with satisfaction. "Make it quick." He gestured for Caleb to cover the front, while he stepped back, arms crossed, anticipating her surrender. Martha turned and stepped back into the shadows of her cabin. But she didn't reach for a shawl. Her movements were swift, economical, born of long planning. She knelt, pried up the loose floorboard beneath her simple bunk, a hiding place Frank had built, just in case. Her fingers closed around a small, tightly wrapped oilskin packet. Inside, brittle with age, were the papers that condemned Arthur Brody. Frank's meticulously kept notes on their original claim, letters detailing Brody's early threats, and the most damning piece, a sworn statement from old Gus, a prospector who'd witnessed Brody rigging the collapse at the mine shaft that killed Frank, signed just days before Gus himself succumbed to lung fever. This was the genesis of Brody's power, the secret buried beneath years of lies. He wasn't just clearing her off this worthless patch. He was silencing the last echo of his original sin. She tucked the packet securely into the bodice of her dress, the stiff paper a shield against her heart. Next, her hand closed around the smooth wooden handle of Frank's hunting knife. The coils of rope followed. She didn't glance back at the life she was leaving. Moving to the rear of the cabin, she eased open the small, warped window, the one with the faulty latch she'd noted weeks ago. She slipped through it like smoke, melting into the gathering darkness, just as Brody's impatient voice called her name from the front porch. When he finally shoved the door open, finding the cabin empty, a curse ripped from his throat. He scanned the darkening land, seeing only emptiness. The fool woman had bolted, run off into the scrub like a terrified rabbit. Good, he thought, spitting into the dust. Saves me the trouble of a trial. He could declare her a fugitive, seize the property legally now. Mounting his horse, he rode back towards Redemption Gulch, a smug sense of victory warming him. He'd won. The widow Hayes was broken, gone. He never once looked back. He didn't see the lone figure moving parallel to the trail, hidden by the terrain, her steps purposeful, her direction steady. Martha Hayes wasn't fleeing. She was closing the distance. She was hunting, and her quarry was waiting, unsuspecting, in the heart of Redemption Gulch, in the sheriff's own office. The weight of the oilskin packet against her chest was both a burden and a fuel. Each step Martha took through the whispering darkness towards Redemption Gulch was a step Frank couldn't take. The brittle papers weren't just evidence. They were Frank's last words, his final, desperate attempt to expose the man who had smiled to his face while plotting his ruin. Brody hadn't just wanted their original claim up the valley, the one rich with color. He'd wanted it all, erasing Frank not just from the registry books, but from life itself. The affidavit from Gus painted the picture vividly. Brody loosening timbers in the old mine shaft, waiting until Frank was down below, then triggering the collapse. A tragic accident, the official report read. Signed off by a territorial judge Brody likely had in his pocket even then. And Martha. Brody had expected her to crumble under grief, to accept the pittance of the marginal land he'd allowed her, to fade away quietly. Her quietness, her endurance, had become an unforeseen complication. He couldn't risk anyone ever digging into Frank's death, not with the water rights becoming crucial. Maybe whispers of new gold strikes further up the creek. Her continued presence was a loose thread that could unravel everything. The arson charge wasn't just convenient, it was necessary, in his mind, to finally sever that thread. This understanding didn't weaken Martha, it focused her. The years of suppressed suspicion, the private grief, the hours spent poring over Frank's hidden notes after finding the packet months after his death, it all coalesced into a single point of chilling clarity. She hadn't known when or how, but she'd known this day might come. Frank hadn't been merely cheated. He'd been murdered for his prosperity. Her fight wasn't just for a small cabin or her meager existence. It was for the truth, for the life stolen from them both. She navigated the sleeping town like a wraith, her worn boots making no sound on the packed earth. The raucous noise from the saloon spilled into the street, but the rest of Redemption Gulch lay silent under a sliver of moon. Ahead, a single lamp cast a lonely yellow square onto the dust, the sheriff's office. Brody was inside, alone, nursing his whiskey and his triumph, just as she knew he would be. He felt safest in his cage, surrounded by the symbols of his power. She reached the back of the building. The rough would cool beneath her touch. The air hung still and heavy. Taking a steadying breath, she tested the faulty window latch. It yielded with a faint click, barely audible above the distant saloon piano. She paused, listening, heard Brody shift in his chair, heard the telltale gurgle of whiskey pouring into a glass. He was oblivious. Lifting the window silently, she slipped inside, melting into the deep shadows cast by towering file cabinets. The air was thick with the smell of stale liquor, cigar smoke, and something else, the faint, acrid scent of arrogance. The game wasn't over. It was just entering its final, deadly stage. Sheriff Arthur Brody let out a sigh of satisfaction, leaning back in his heavy oak chair. The whiskey warmed him, chasing away the lingering chill of the evening. Martha Hayes was gone. Fled. Problem solved. Tomorrow, he'd file the paperwork, claim the abandoned property, secure the water rights. Everything neat, tidy. He raised his glass in a silent toast to his own cleverness. A floorboard creaked behind him. Brody froze, the glass halfway to his lips. He slowly turned, annoyance tightening his features. "Caleb? That you boy? Didn't I tell you to?" His words died in his throat. Stepping out from the deepest shadow near the gun rack was Martha Hayes. Her face, illuminated by the single flickering lamp, was eerily calm, but her eyes held a fire that seemed to suck the air from the room. In her hand, held loosely at her side but radiating menace, was the long, wickedly sharp blade of a hunting knife. Frank's knife. A jolt of adrenaline shot through Brody, scattering the whiskey haze. He scrambled to his feet, chair scraping harshly against the wooden floor. His right hand automatically darted towards the comforting weight of the peacemaker at his hip. But Martha moved like lightning honed by years of suppressed rage. She didn't lunge or slash. She moved with him, anticipating his draw. As his fingers closed around the gun's handle, she slammed his entire forearm, hard, against the unyielding edge of his desk. Bone grated. An explosion of pain shot up his arm, and his fingers spasmed open. The Colt fell, landing with a heavy thud, then bounced away into the darkness under the desk. Brody gasped, stumbling back, clutching his injured arm. Before he could even think to shout, she was on him, pressing her advantage. He was heavier, perhaps stronger in a bar fight, but she possessed the focused, desperate strength of absolute conviction. She shoved him backwards, hard, sending him sprawling back into his chair. In the same fluid motion, the hunting knife came up, the point finding the soft spot, just under his chin, pressing upwards with chilling force. He froze, breath locked in his chest. The metal was ice-cold against his skin. He could feel the razor edge threatening to break the surface. "Don't move, Sheriff," Martha's voice commanded. It was unnervingly quiet, stripped bare of any emotion but cold, hard intent. "Martha, listen, this is crazy. You'll hang for this," Brody stammered, his eyes wide with disbelief and burgeoning panic. His usual tools, intimidation, bluster, were useless against the dead calm in her eyes. Crazy. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, devoid of warmth. "No, Sheriff. I think crazy is stealing a man's claim, arranging for him to die in a collapsed mine shaft, and then trying to drive his widow off the last scrap of land she owns. That sounds like crazy to me. Or maybe just evil." Brody's face went slack, the blood draining from it. He started to shake, a fine tremor at first, then visibly. How could you know?" She used her free hand to pull the oilskin packet from her dress. She didn't toss it this time. She held it up, inches from his face. "Frank kept records, Arthur. Meticulous ones. And Gus had a conscience before he died. He remembered everything he saw that day at the shaft. Your face. Your hurry to leave before the dust settled." Brody stared at the packet as if it were a viper poised to strike. His world, built on secrets and violence, was imploding. He was trapped, disarmed, facing the specter of his buried past. You got no proof anyone will believe," he whispered, the words weak, desperate. Maybe Martha conceded, the knife pressing just a fraction deeper. A single, bright red drop of blood welled and traced a slow path down his neck. He whimpered, a pathetic sound. "But proof for the marshals is for later. Tonight is about you. About confession." She nodded towards the pen and paper still sitting on his desk from his earlier administrative work. "You're going to write it all down. Everything you did to Frank. Everything you did to me. The fraud. The threats. The mine. The fire tonight. You owe him the truth, Arthur. You owe me the truth." He looked wildly from the knife to the paper, then towards the locked front door. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. He was utterly, completely at her mercy. The untouchable sheriff, finally touched by retribution. He tried one last gamble, a flicker of his old cunning returning. "Martha, we can make a deal. I have money, land." "Right," she interrupted, the single word colder and sharper than the blade itself. His resolve shattered. The arrogance bled out of him, leaving only a terrified, broken man. Sobbing now, his shoulders slumped in defeat, his good hand trembling uncontrollably, Arthur Brody picked up the pen. Under the unwavering gaze of the woman whose life he had destroyed, guided by the cold pressure at his throat, he began to write his confession, each scratch of the nib sealing his fate. He detailed the initial scheme to defraud Frank Hayes of his gold-rich claim, the escalation of threats, the calculated sabotage leading to the mine collapse, the forged documents, the years of ensuring Martha remained isolated and poor, and finally, the arson plot designed to remove her permanently. His signature at the bottom was a barely legible scrawl. Just as he finished, Martha efficiently used the rope she carried to bind his hands behind the chair, then secured his ankles. As she stepped back, satisfied with her work, the front door of the sheriff's office creaked open slowly. Deputy Caleb stood silhouetted against the faint pre-dawn light, holding a lantern high. "Sheriff?" I thought I heard his voice trailed off as the lantern light illuminated the scene within. His boss, the fearsome Sheriff Brody, bound, gagged, pale as death, tears streaming down his face. The signed confession laid out starkly on the desk. And standing over him, Frank Hayes's hunting knife, now held loosely at her side, was the widow Martha Hayes, her expression exhausted but grimly triumphant. The balance of power in Redemption Gulch had irrevocably shifted. The sun rose on a Redemption Gulch reeling from disbelief. Deputy Caleb, after a moment of stunned silence, had acted decisively. He'd reinforced Brody's bonds, taken possession of the damning confession, and placed his former boss securely behind the bars of the cell usually reserved for drunks and petty thieves. Then, saddling the fastest horse, he'd ridden like the wind towards the territorial capital, carrying the evidence that would shatter the town's uneasy peace. Word spread like tumbleweeds in a gale. Whispers turned to open discussion, then to stunned pronouncements on the porch of the general store. Some townsfolk reacted with righteous anger, recalling small injustices, unexplained fines, the pervasive fear Brody had cultivated. They felt vindicated, perhaps slightly ashamed they hadn't suspected the full depth of his depravity sooner. Others, who had perhaps benefited from Brody's reign or simply preferred the devil they knew, looked uneasy, glancing nervously towards the jailhouse, where their symbol of order now sat disgraced. The Miller family, learning the fire was deliberate arson aimed at framing Martha, felt a chill deeper than the morning air. Redemption Gulch was forced to look at itself, at the fear it had lived under, and the quiet woman who had finally broken the spell. U.S. Marshals arrived days later, their presence imposing and official. They listened stoically to Caleb's account, read the confession, and took Arthur Brody away in chains, his destination a federal courthouse, and the grim promise of territorial prison. His reign of fear was definitively over. But Martha Hayes was not there to witness his final humiliation. Sometime in the pre-dawn hours, after ensuring Caleb had secured Brody and the confession, she had slipped away as silently as she had arrived. She returned briefly to her cabin, gathering only a few essential belongings and the precious oilskin packet containing Frank's memory. She left the cabin, the troubled land, the stream Brody had coveted, all behind. They were stained with bad blood, bad memories. She rode east, away from Redemption Gulch, towards a horizon painted with the promise of a new day. She didn't look back. The town would create its own legends about her. The quiet widow, the unlikely avenger, the ghost of justice. Let them talk. She carried her own truth, Frank's truth, inside her. The vast expanse of the frontier stretched before her, daunting yet liberating. She didn't know what lay ahead, what town or territory might offer a fresh start. But the crushing weight of years of grief and injustice had lifted. She had faced the monster who had haunted her life and forced him to confront his sins. It wasn't vengeance she had sought, not entirely. It was reckoning. It was reclaiming the narrative, ensuring Frank's name was cleared, ensuring Brody's crimes saw the light of day. As she rode, the sun warming her face, Martha Hayes felt a sense of hard-won peace settle over her, the quiet strength of a survivor who had not only endured but prevailed against the brutal odds of the untamed West. Her future was unwritten, but for the first time in a long time, she held the pen.